David checked his watch one more time as he sat in his car outside the tall glass building. 28 minutes early. Perfect. He had learned long ago that being on time meant being early, and being early meant showing respect for other people's schedules. He pulled down the visor mirror and straightened his navy blue tie. The reflection staring back at him looked professional and confident. 15 years in software development had taught him a lot, but today felt different somehow. This wasn't just another job interview. This was the opportunity he had been working toward his entire career. TechFlow Industries was one of the biggest names in the tech world. Their software powered everything from banking systems to social media platforms that millions of people used every day. Getting a senior developer position here would be like winning the lottery for someone in his field. David grabbed his leather portfolio from the passenger seat. Inside were printed copies of his resume, recommendation letters from previous employers, and examples of code he had written for successful projects. He had spent the weekend organizing everything perfectly, making sure each document told the story of his journey from a curious teenager learning to code in his bedroom to an experienced professional who had helped build systems for Fortune 500 companies. The lobby of TechFlow Industries was exactly what he expected. Modern furniture, sleek design, and walls covered with awards and recognition certificates. A friendly receptionist with a warm smile directed him to the 11th floor, where he would meet with the hiring manager for the senior developer role. As the elevator climbed higher, David thought about the phone conversation he had with the HR representative just a week ago. She had been genuinely excited about his background, and had even mentioned that his experience with cloud computing and database management was exactly what they needed for their upcoming projects. The technical skills assessment he completed online had gone smoothly, too. Every question felt like something he dealt with in his daily work. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and David stepped into a hallway lined with glass-walled conference rooms. Through the transparent walls, he could see teams of developers working together on whiteboards, pointing at screens, and having the kind of animated discussions that happened when smart people were solving complex problems. This was his world. This was where he belonged. A tall man in his late 40s appeared from around the corner. He was wearing an expensive-looking suit and had the kind of confident walk that suggested he was used to being in charge. His salt-and-pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his handshake was firm when he introduced himself as Robert, the engineering manager who would be conducting the interview. "Thanks for coming in today," Robert said, though his tone seemed a bit more formal than David had expected. "I've looked over your resume and it's quite impressive." They walked together toward a corner office with windows overlooking the city. David noticed how other employees nodded respectfully to Robert as they passed. This was clearly someone with influence in the company. The office was spacious and organized, with computer monitors displaying lines of code and project timelines. Robert gestured toward a chair across from his desk, and they both sat down. "So tell me about yourself," Robert began, leaning back in his chair. David launched into the presentation he had practiced. He talked about his early days learning programming languages, his first job at a small startup where he had to wear multiple hats and solve problems that bigger companies would assign to entire teams. He described his growth into more complex projects, his experience leading development teams, and his track record of delivering software solutions on time and within budget. Robert nodded along, occasionally asking technical questions that David answered with confidence. When asked about his experience with the specific programming languages that TechFlow used, David was able to provide detailed examples of projects where he had used those exact tools. When Robert inquired about his problem-solving approach, David walked him through a recent challenge where he had debugged a critical system failure that was costing his previous employer thousands of dollars every hour it remained down. "Impressive," Robert said, though his expression remained neutral. "What about your experience working in large corporate environments?" David explained his time at his previous company, which had over 5,000 employees. He had worked directly with executive teams, managed projects worth millions of dollars, and had even been asked to mentor junior developers who were just starting their careers. As the conversation continued, David began to notice something subtle but unmistakable. Robert's questions started shifting away from technical abilities and work experience. Instead, he began asking about David's background, his neighborhood, and even his family situation. "Where did you grow up? Robert asked, leaning forward slightly. David answered honestly, mentioning the working-class neighborhood where his parents still lived. He talked about how his father had worked 2 jobs to support the family, and how his mother had encouraged his interest in computers, even when money was tight. "And what do you do in your free time?" Robert continued. David mentioned his volunteer work teaching coding to kids at a local community center, his love for jazz music, and his weekend basketball games with friends from college. All perfectly normal interests that showed he was a well-rounded person. But something in Robert's body language had changed. The questions kept coming, each one feeling less relevant to the job and more like an investigation into David's personal life. "What kind of music do you listen to? What restaurants do you like? Do you have a family?" David answered each question politely, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. These weren't the kinds of questions that typically came up in technical interviews. He had been through dozens of interviews over the years, and this felt different. Despite the strange direction of the conversation, David maintained his professionalism. When Robert asked him to solve a coding problem on the whiteboard, David's solution was elegant and efficient. When presented with a hypothetical system design challenge, David outlined an approach that impressed even himself with its creativity and practicality. The technical portion of the interview went flawlessly. Every question Robert asked about programming, system architecture, and project management received a confident, detailed response. David could see that Robert was genuinely impressed with his technical knowledge, even if he was trying to hide it. Near the end of the interview, Robert's phone rang. He answered it briefly, and David overheard him mention something about cultural fit and team dynamics to whoever was on the other end of the line. When Robert hung up, he looked at David with what seemed like a forced smile. "Well, I think we've covered everything we need to today. You'll hear back from us within the next few days with our decision." David stood up and shook Robert's hand again, thanking him for his time and expressing his genuine enthusiasm for the opportunity to join the TechFlow team. As he walked back toward the elevator, he felt confident about his performance but couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about the whole experience had been unusual. In the elevator going down, David replayed the interview in his mind. His technical answers had been solid. His experience was exactly what they were looking for. His enthusiasm for the company and the role had been genuine and obvious. So why did he have this uncomfortable feeling in the pit of his stomach? As he walked across the lobby toward the exit, David told himself that he was overthinking things. Interviews were always a bit awkward, and different companies had different styles. Maybe Robert was just thorough, or maybe he had been having a difficult day. But deep down, David knew something hadn't felt right. And unfortunately, his instincts were about to prove correct in ways he never could have imagined. 3 days passed without a word from TechFlow Industries. David tried to stay busy, working on personal coding projects and applying to other positions, but he found himself checking his email every few minutes. The waiting was always the hardest part of job hunting. On Thursday morning, while David was having his coffee and reviewing code for a freelance project, his phone buzzed with a new email notification. The sender was TechFlow Industries. His heart raced as he opened the message. The email was disappointingly brief and impersonal. It thanked him for his interest in the position and his time during the interview process. However, after careful consideration, they had decided to move forward with another candidate whose background and experience were a better match for their current team needs and company culture. David stared at the screen for a long moment, reading the rejection letter twice to make sure he understood it correctly. After careful consideration, better match for their current team needs? The words felt hollow and meaningless. He had been through plenty of rejections before. Job hunting was always a numbers game, and even the most qualified candidates faced plenty of no responses. But this one felt different. This one didn't make sense. David opened his laptop and reviewed his notes from the interview. Every technical question had been answered correctly. His experience matched their requirements perfectly. The HR representative had been enthusiastic about his background. Even Robert had seemed impressed with his coding abilities and problem-solving approach. So what had gone wrong? Meanwhile, across town at TechFlow Industries, Robert was sitting in his office feeling surprisingly uncomfortable about the decision he had made. The email rejection had been sent, But something about the whole situation was bothering him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. From a purely technical standpoint, David had been exceptional. His answers to the programming questions had been some of the best Robert had seen in years of conducting interviews. His experience was extensive and directly relevant. His references were outstanding. But Robert had convinced himself that there were other factors to consider beyond just technical skills. Team chemistry was important. Cultural fit mattered. These were the phrases he kept repeating to himself as he justified his decision. The truth was more complicated and more uncomfortable than Robert wanted to admit, even to himself. When David had walked into his office, something had immediately felt off to Robert. Not because of anything David had said or done, but because of assumptions and biases that Robert carried without even realizing it. David didn't look like what Robert unconsciously expected a senior developer at their company to look like. He didn't sound like what Robert thought their team needed. These weren't conscious thoughts, but rather deep-seated prejudices that influenced Robert's judgment in ways he would have denied if anyone had asked him directly. Instead of recognizing these biases, Robert had rationalized his discomfort by focusing on vague concepts like team dynamics and company culture. He had convinced himself that his gut feeling about David not being the right fit was based on legitimate professional concerns. The candidate Robert had hired instead was someone named Kevin, a developer with decent technical skills but significantly less experience than David. Kevin had gone to the same university as Robert, played golf at the same country club, and lived in the same affluent neighborhood. During Kevin's interview, Robert had felt immediately comfortable and had found himself imagining Kevin fitting in perfectly with the existing team. What Robert didn't realize was that his comfort with Kevin and his discomfort with David had nothing to do with their professional qualifications and everything to do with his own unconscious biases. While Robert was trying to forget about the interview and move on with his regular work, someone else in the company was paying attention to what had happened. Lisa was a junior developer who had been asked to review the technical assessments for both candidates as part of the evaluation process. Lisa had been working at TechFlow for only 8 months, but she had already developed a reputation for being thorough and detail-oriented. When she compared David's technical assessment results with Kevin's, she was confused by the final hiring decision. David's code samples were cleaner, more efficient, and demonstrated a deeper understanding of complex programming concepts. His system design proposal was innovative and showed creative thinking about scalability issues that the company would likely face in the future. His answers to the technical questions were comprehensive and showed real-world experience with the exact challenges their team was trying to solve. Kevin's assessment results were adequate but unremarkable. His code worked but wasn't particularly elegant. His system design was conventional and didn't address some important considerations that David had identified. His technical interview responses were correct but basic. Lisa found herself wondering why such an obviously superior candidate had been rejected. She considered asking Robert directly but decided against it. As a junior employee, she didn't feel comfortable questioning the decisions of someone at Robert's level. Instead, she decided to quietly document what she had observed. Lisa had heard stories from friends at other tech companies about talented candidates being overlooked for reasons that had nothing to do with their abilities. She hoped she was wrong about what might have happened here, but she wanted to have a record just in case. David, meanwhile, was trying to understand what had gone wrong. He reached out to a mentor who had been in the tech industry for over 20 years, someone who had guided David through several career transitions and had always given him honest advice. "Sometimes these things just don't work out," his mentor told him over coffee. "But I have to say, based on what you're telling me about that interview, something seems off. Your technical skills are solid, your experience is exactly what they need, and you prepared thoroughly. The questions about your personal background are particularly concerning." The mentor had seen situations like this before. He had watched qualified candidates get passed over for reasons that seemed to have more to do with prejudice than professional evaluation. He encouraged David to trust his instincts about the interview, feeling strange, and to keep looking for opportunities at companies that would appreciate his talents. Back at TechFlow, the newly hired Kevin was struggling more than anyone had expected. The project he had been assigned was more complex than Robert had anticipated, and Kevin's limitations were becoming apparent quickly. Code that should have taken a few days to write was taking weeks. Problems that an experienced developer should have been able to solve independently required constant guidance from other team members. Robert found himself spending hours each week helping Kevin with tasks that should have been routine for someone at his level. Other developers on the team were starting to express frustration with having to constantly review and fix Kevin's work. But Robert was determined to make the hire work. He had convinced himself that Kevin just needed time to adjust to the company's systems and processes. He created elaborate training plans and assigned senior developers to mentor Kevin through the challenges. What Robert didn't want to acknowledge was that he had made a mistake. He had chosen cultural comfort over professional competence, and now the entire team was paying the price for that decision. The irony was that while Robert was struggling to bring Kevin up to the level the company needed, David was excelling at a contract position with a smaller tech company. Within 2 weeks of starting his new role, David had identified and solved a critical security vulnerability that could have cost his new employer millions of dollars if it had been exploited. His new colleagues were impressed not just with his technical skills, but with his collaborative approach to problem-solving and his ability to explain complex concepts to team members with different levels of experience. David was exactly the kind of senior developer that any company would be lucky to have, but TechFlow Industries had let him walk away because their hiring manager had been influenced by biases he didn't even realize he possessed. The consequences of that decision were about to become much more serious than anyone could have imagined. 6 months had passed since David's interview, and TechFlow Industries was facing the kind of crisis that could destroy a company overnight. What started as minor glitches in their flagship software had escalated into a full-blown disaster that was costing them millions of dollars and threatening their reputation in the industry. The problems began appearing in their main product about 3 weeks earlier. At first, they seemed like random bugs that could be fixed with routine updates. A few users reported data sync issues. Some customers mentioned occasional slowdowns during peak usage hours. Nothing that seemed immediately catastrophic, but the issues kept getting worse. The data sync problems evolved into complete system failures that left customers unable to access their accounts for hours at a time. The slowdowns became total crashes that affected thousands of users simultaneously. Customer support was being flooded with angry complaints and threats to cancel contracts. Robert was in full panic mode. The project he had assigned to Kevin, the developer he had hired instead of David, was at the center of the disaster. The code Kevin had written contained fundamental flaws that were causing cascading failures throughout the entire system. Every attempt to fix one problem seemed to create 2 new ones. Kevin was working 16-hour days but couldn't keep up with the mounting issues. Other developers on the team had been pulled from their own projects to help with the crisis, but they were struggling to understand and fix code that had been poorly designed from the beginning. The situation reached a breaking point when Global Corp, TechFlow's biggest client, called an emergency meeting. Global Corp was responsible for nearly 30% of TechFlow's revenue, and they were threatening to terminate their contract immediately if the problems weren't resolved within the next 2 weeks. "We can't have our systems going down every other day," the Global Corp executive explained during a tense video conference call. "Our customers are losing confidence in us because your software keeps failing. We've already started looking at alternatives, and if these issues aren't completely resolved by next Friday, we're moving to a different provider." After the call ended, TechFlow's CEO, Patricia Williams, called an emergency company-wide meeting. Patricia was known for staying calm under pressure, but everyone could see the stress in her face as she addressed the entire staff. "We're facing the most serious challenge in our company's history," she began. "Our main product is failing, our biggest client is ready to walk away, and we have less than 2 weeks to fix problems that should never have existed in the first place." She explained that if they lost the Balcorp contract, they would likely have to lay off at least 40% of their workforce. Other clients were already expressing concerns, and the company's reputation in the industry was being damaged every day the problems continued. "I need everyone to think about this situation from every possible angle," Patricia continued. "Are there any resources we haven't considered? Any approaches we haven't tried? Anyone you know who might be able to help us solve these problems?" The room was silent except for the sound of people shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. The technical team had been working around the clock for weeks and they were running out of ideas. Lisa, the junior developer who had reviewed David's assessment months earlier, raised her hand tentatively. As one of the newest and youngest employees, she rarely spoke up in company-wide meetings, but something was nagging at her about the current situation. "I might have an idea," she said quietly, "but I'd like to speak with you privately after the meeting if that's possible." Patricia nodded and made a mental note to follow up with Lisa. At this point, she was willing to consider any suggestion that might help save the company. After the meeting, Lisa approached Patricia in her office. She looked nervous but determined as she began to explain what she had observed during the hiring process 6 months earlier. There was a candidate who interviewed for the senior developer position back in the spring. Lisa began carefully. His technical assessment scores were exceptional. His experience was exactly what we needed. But he was rejected and we hired someone else instead. Patricia leaned forward, intrigued. She wasn't directly involved in most hiring decisions, but she was always interested in understanding how the company made personnel choices. "I reviewed both candidates' technical assessments," Lisa continued. "The person we didn't hire had solutions that were more elegant, more efficient, and showed a much deeper understanding of the exact types of problems we're dealing with now." Lisa pulled out the documentation she had quietly maintained over the past 6 months. She showed Patricia the technical assessment results, the code samples, and her notes about the stark difference in capabilities between the two candidates. "His name is David Johnson," Lisa explained. "I looked him up recently, and he's been doing amazing work at Richardson Technologies. He solved a major security issue for them within his first month, and he's been leading their most important project since then." Patricia studied the documents Lisa had provided. The difference in technical ability between David and Kevin was immediately obvious, even to someone who wasn't a developer herself. David's solutions were creative, efficient, and demonstrated the kind of advanced thinking that could solve complex problems. Kevin's work was adequate but basic. "Why wasn't this person hired?" Patricia asked, though she was already beginning to suspect the answer might be uncomfortable. Lisa hesitated. As a junior employee, she was reluctant to directly criticize a manager, especially someone at Robert's level. But the company was in crisis and she felt an obligation to speak honestly. "I'm not entirely sure," she said carefully, "but based on the technical evaluations, it should have been an obvious choice. I've been wondering about it for months." Patricia thanked Lisa for bringing this information to her attention and promised to look into the situation immediately. As soon as Lisa left her office, Patricia began making calls to investigate what had happened during David's hiring process. She started by reviewing the interview notes and feedback forms. Robert's technical evaluation of David was overwhelmingly positive. Every section related to programming ability, problem-solving skills, and relevant experience had been marked as excellent or outstanding, but Robert's overall recommendation had been to reject David based on what he had described as cultural fit, concerns and questions about team integration. The UI notes were vague and didn't provide specific examples of what these concerns were based on. Patricia then called the HR representative who had conducted David's initial phone screening. The feedback from that conversation had been enthusiastic and positive. David had been professional, knowledgeable, and genuinely excited about the opportunity to join TechFlow. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and Patricia didn't like the picture that was emerging. It appeared that a highly qualified candidate had been rejected for reasons that had nothing to do with his ability to do the job, while a less qualified candidate had been hired instead. And now that decision was potentially going to cost the company everything. Patricia realized she needed to act quickly. The technical team was still struggling with problems they couldn't solve, and time was running out before Global Corp walked away. If David was as capable as his assessment results suggested, he might be their only hope of saving the company. But reaching out to a candidate who had been rejected months earlier would be awkward and potentially embarrassing, especially if her suspicions about the reasons for that rejection were correct. Still, with the company's survival at stake, Patricia knew she had to swallow her pride and make the call. She just hoped David would be willing to listen to what she had to say. What happened next would shock everyone involved and change the trajectory of TechFlow Industries forever. David was in the middle of debugging a complex database issue for Richardson Technologies when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something told him to answer it anyway. "Hello, is this David Johnson?" The voice was professional and confident, with the kind of authority that suggested this was someone used to making important decisions. "Yes, this is David. My name is Patricia Williams, and I'm the CEO of TechFlow Industries. I know this call might come as a surprise, but I was hoping we could have a conversation about a situation that's developed at our company." David nearly dropped his phone. The CEO of TechFlow Industries was calling him personally, 6 months after they had rejected his application for a senior developer position. "I'm listening," David said cautiously. Patricia took a deep breath before continuing. This was one of the most difficult conversations she had ever had to have as a CEO. "But the company's survival might depend on how it went, David. I'm going to be completely honest with you about why I'm calling. We're facing a serious crisis with our main software product, and after reviewing your interview materials and technical assessments, I believe you might be the person who can help us solve it." She went on to explain the situation with Global Corp, the system failures that were happening daily, and the fact that the company was on the verge of losing its biggest client and possibly going out of business entirely. "I know this puts you in an awkward position," Patricia continued. "We rejected your application 6 months ago, and now I'm calling to ask for your help. I want you to know that I've reviewed the entire hiring process, and I have serious concerns about how that decision was made." David listened in stunned silence as Patricia described the technical assessment reviews, the stark difference between his qualifications and those of the person who was actually hired, and the lack of clear justification for the rejection decision. "I'm not going to make excuses for what happened," Patricia said, "but I am going to be completely transparent with you about our current situation and what we would need from you if you were willing to help us." Patricia explained that they needed someone to come in as an emergency contractor to identify and fix the critical issues that were causing system failures. The problems were complex and required someone with advanced skills and extensive experience with the exact technologies David had worked with throughout his career. "I understand if you're not interested," Patricia said, "but if you are willing to consider it, I'm prepared to offer you a consulting rate that's 3 times what we were planning to pay for the original position, plus a bonus structure based on how quickly you can resolve our issues." David sat quietly for a long moment, processing what he had just heard. Part of him was angry about the rejection 6 months earlier, especially now that he was learning it might not have been based on his qualifications. But another part of him was intrigued by the challenge and the opportunity to prove what he was capable of. "Can you tell me more about the specific technical problems you're facing?" David asked. Patricia connected him with the head of the technical team, who gave David a detailed breakdown of the issues. As David listened to the description of system failures, database corruption, and cascading errors, he began to form hypotheses about what might be causing the problems. "Based on what you're describing, it sounds like there might be fundamental architectural issues with how the different system components are communicating with each other," David said. "The symptoms you're mentioning are consistent with problems I've seen before when code hasn't been properly designed to handle high-volume, concurrent operations." His analysis was so insightful and accurate that the technical team leader was immediately impressed. David was asking the right questions and identifying potential root causes that their internal team hadn't even considered. After the call ended, David thought carefully about Patricia's offer. He had been happy at Richardson Technologies, where he was respected and valued for his contributions. Taking on a consulting project at TechFlow would mean working long hours on someone else's crisis, potentially dealing with hostile team members who might resent an outsider coming in to fix their problems. But something about the challenge appealed to him. This was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes problem that he had built his career solving. And if he was being completely honest with himself, there was a part of him that wanted to show TechFlow what they had missed when they rejected him. David called Patricia back the next morning. "I'll take the project," he said, "but I have some conditions. I want complete access to all the code and systems. I want to work directly with your technical team without interference from management. And I want regular communication with you about my findings and recommendations." Patricia agreed to all of his terms immediately. She was so relieved that David was willing to help that she would have agreed to almost anything. David started work at TechFlow the following Monday. Walking into the building where he had been rejected months earlier felt surreal, but he pushed those feelings aside and focused on the task at hand. His first step was to conduct a comprehensive audit of the entire system. He spent the initial 2 days reviewing thousands of lines of code, analyzing database structures, and mapping out how different components of the software interacted with each other. What he discovered was even worse than he had expected. The code that Kevin had written wasn't just inefficient or poorly organized. It contained fundamental design flaws that made system failures inevitable as usage volume increased. It was like building a house on a foundation made of sand and then being surprised when it collapsed. But David also identified solutions. The problems were serious, but they were fixable if approached systematically with the right expertise and enough time. David worked 18-hour days for the next week, rewriting critical sections of code, optimizing database queries, and implementing proper error handling throughout the system. He barely slept, sustained by coffee and the satisfaction of seeing problems get resolved one by one. The results were immediate and dramatic. System crashes that had been happening multiple times per day stopped occurring entirely. Performance issues that had been frustrating users for months were resolved. Data sync problems that had been corrupting customer information were eliminated completely. By the end of the second week, David had not only fixed all the existing problems but had identified and addressed potential issues that would have caused even bigger problems in the future. He had essentially rebuilt the core architecture of their software to make it more stable, more efficient, and more scalable. Patricia and the technical team were amazed by what David had accomplished. In 2 weeks, working essentially alone, he had solved problems that their entire development team had been unable to fix in months of trying. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. During his systematic review of the code base, David had discovered something that went far beyond just technical problems. The issues with Kevin's code weren't just the result of inexperience or poor judgment. They suggested a pattern of decisions that showed a fundamental misunderstanding of software development principles. When David shared his findings with Patricia, she realized that Robert's hiring decision had been even worse than she had initially thought. Not only had he rejected a highly qualified candidate, but he had hired someone who was actively harmful to the company's technical infrastructure. Patricia asked David to document everything he had found and to provide recommendations for how to prevent similar problems in the future. His report was comprehensive, professional, and devastating in its analysis of the systematic failures that had led to the crisis. Reading David's report, Patricia realized that this situation was about much more than just one bad hiring decision. It was about the unconscious biases and flawed judgment processes that could destroy a company if left unchecked. She also realized that David was exactly the kind of technical leader that TechFlow needed for the future. His skills, his work ethic, and his ability to solve complex problems under pressure were extraordinary. Letting him walk away again would be the biggest mistake the company could make. Patricia scheduled a meeting with David to discuss not just his consulting project, but the possibility of him joining TechFlow permanently in a role that would recognize his true value to the organization. What she offered him next would exceed even David's expectations and would change the trajectory of both his career and the company's future. Patricia's office felt different this time when David walked in for their meeting. 2 weeks earlier, he had been a consultant brought in to solve an emergency. Now he was being treated like the technical leader everyone wished they had hired from the beginning. David, I want to start by apologizing, Patricia began. Not just for the crisis that brought you here, but for the hiring process that kept you away from us in the first place. What happened 6 months ago was wrong, and I take full responsibility for not having systems in place to prevent it. David appreciated her honesty, but he was more interested in looking forward than dwelling on the past. I'm here now, he said simply. What matters is what we do next. Patricia smiled at his professionalism. That's exactly the attitude that makes me want to offer you a permanent position. Not just any position, but a role that reflects your actual value to this organization. She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an offer letter for the position of senior technical architect, a role that was 2 levels higher than the original job he had been rejected for. The salary was 40% more than what Robert had been authorized to offer 6 months earlier. This position would put you in charge of all major technical decisions for our core products, Patricia explained. You would lead a team of developers, set technical standards for the entire company, and have direct input on product strategy and development priorities. David read through the offer carefully. It was more than generous, but what impressed him most was that Patricia had clearly thought about creating a role that would utilize his skills and experience. Effectively, I accept, David said without hesitation. But Patricia wasn't finished with the conversation. There's something else we need to discuss, and it's not going to be comfortable. During my investigation into what happened during your original interview, I discovered some troubling patterns in our hiring practices. She explained that she had conducted a thorough review of Robert's hiring decisions over the previous 3 years. What she found was a clear pattern of highly qualified minority candidates being rejected, while less qualified candidates from similar backgrounds to Robert were consistently hired. I've already spoken with our legal team, and we're taking immediate action, Patricia continued. Robert has been terminated, and we're implementing comprehensive changes to our hiring process to ensure this never happens again. The news about Robert's termination didn't surprise David, but he was interested in hearing about the systemic changes Patricia had in mind. We're implementing blind resume reviews where names and other identifying information are removed during initial screening, Patricia explained. We're requiring diverse interview panels for all technical positions, and we're providing mandatory bias training for everyone involved in hiring decisions. Patricia also shared that the company would be conducting outreach programs to historically Black colleges and universities, coding boot camps in underserved communities, and professional organizations focused on increasing diversity in tech. I want you to lead these initiatives, Patricia said. Your experience both as an exceptional developer and as someone who has faced discrimination in hiring gives you unique insights that could help us build a better company culture. David was intrigued by the opportunity to create systemic change, but he had one important question. What about the other developers on the team? How do they feel about me coming in at this level? Patricia had been prepared for this question. I've already had individual conversations with each team member. They're all aware of the technical work you did during your consulting period, and they've seen firsthand how your solutions solved problems they had been struggling with for months. To be honest, most of them are excited to work with someone of your caliber. She also mentioned that Kevin had been moved to a different role where his skills were better suited to the responsibilities. It wasn't personal, Patricia explained, but it was clear that he wasn't ready for the level of responsibility we had given him. The move is actually better for his career development in the long run. David started his new role the following Monday, and the transformation at TechFlow was immediate and dramatic. His first initiative was to establish technical standards and code review processes that would prevent the kinds of problems they had experienced with Kevin's work. He also began working with the recruiting team to identify and reach out to talented developers from diverse backgrounds. Within 3 months, TechFlow had hired 4 new developers, including 2 women and 1 Latino developer who had been overlooked by other companies despite having exceptional qualifications. The diversity initiatives David led began attracting attention throughout the tech industry. He was invited to speak at conferences about creating inclusive hiring practices and building diverse technical teams. His presentations were well received because he spoke from personal experience about both the costs of bias and the benefits of inclusive practices. 6 months after, David joined TechFlow as senior technical architect. He was promoted to director of engineering. The team he had built was widely regarded as one of the most talented and innovative development groups in the company's history. Under David's leadership, TechFlow not only retained the Global Corp contract, but secured 3 additional major clients who were impressed by the stability and performance improvements in the company's software. The technical excellence of David's team became a major selling point for the company's sales efforts. The transformation wasn't just technical. The company culture became more collaborative, more innovative, and more welcoming to people from all backgrounds. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvements across all departments, not just the technical teams. Robert, meanwhile, was struggling to find employment in the tech industry. Word had spread about his discriminatory hiring practices, and companies were reluctant to take on someone with his track record. He eventually found work at a much smaller company for significantly less money than he had been making at TechFlow. The contrast between Robert's decline and David's success became a powerful example throughout the industry of how bias hurts everyone involved. Companies that practiced discriminatory hiring lost access to top talent, while inclusive companies attracted the best developers and achieved better business results. 1 year after David joined TechFlow, Patricia asked him to present the company's diversity and inclusion results at the annual board meeting. The numbers were impressive. Technical team productivity was up 30%. Employee retention had improved significantly, and the company had saved millions of dollars by avoiding the kinds of technical problems that had nearly destroyed them a year earlier. The most important thing we learned, David told the board, is that diversity isn't just about fairness or doing the right thing, although those are important reasons to pursue it. Diversity is also about business success. When you exclude talented people because of bias, you're not just hurting those individuals. You're hurting your own company's ability to compete and succeed. The board was so impressed with the results that they asked David to help develop similar programs for other departments throughout the company. His influence extended far beyond the technical teams to include sales, marketing, and even executive recruitment. 3 years after his initial rejection, David was promoted to Chief Technology Officer, making him one of the youngest executives in TechFlow's history. His story had become legendary within the company, not as a tale of overcoming discrimination, but as proof of what could be achieved when organizations were willing to examine their biases and change their practices. The most shocking thing about David's success wasn't just how far he had risen or how much money he was making. It was how his experience had transformed an entire company culture and created opportunities for countless other people who might have been overlooked by biased hiring practices. David often reflected on how different things might have been if Patricia hadn't been willing to acknowledge the company's mistakes and take action to correct them. His success was remarkable, but it was also a reminder of how many other talented people were probably being overlooked every day by companies that hadn't learned these lessons yet. The real victory wasn't just David's personal achievement. It was the knowledge that TechFlow had become the kind of place where talent would be recognized and valued, regardless of who possessed it, and that other companies were beginning to follow their example. Sometimes the most shocking outcomes come not from dramatic confrontations or revenge, but from organizations having the courage to admit their mistakes and commit to doing better. David's story proved that justice doesn't always require punishment. Sometimes it requires transformation.